There is a phrase that keeps coming up. It does not matter which NATO country the pilot is from. It does not matter whether they flew out of a Norwegian base above the Arctic Circle or scrambled from a Romanian airfield near the Black Sea. It does not matter if they have been flying for 8 years or 22. Every single one of them, when asked about the moment they pulled up alongside a Russian Su-57 in the sky, says almost exactly the same thing. And when you hear what that thing is, and when you understand what it means, you will never look at modern air combat the same way again. Before we go any further, if you are interested in the machines, the pilots, and the invisible wars happening in the skies above Europe and the Pacific every single day, subscribe right now. Most people watching this have not subscribed yet. It takes 2 seconds, and you will never miss a story like this one. Now let us talk about what is actually happening up there, because this is not a story that lives in press releases or defense ministry briefings. This is a story told in cockpits, in debrief rooms, in hushed conversations at NATO air bases, where pilots who have flown alongside or against Russian aircraft try to put language to something that genuinely unsettled them. The Su-57 is Russia's answer to a question that has haunted their aerospace engineers for decades. How do you build a fighter jet that can compete with the best the West has ever produced? And the answer they came up with is something that NATO pilots who have intercepted it describe in ways that are specific, consistent, and in some cases deeply concerning. This is the full story of the Su-57, not the sanitized version, not the version where Western analysts dismiss it and Russian state media oversells it. The real version, told through the eyes of the pilots who have actually seen it up close, in the air, at speed, in real operational conditions. Let us start at the beginning, because to understand what NATO pilots are saying about the Su-57 today, you need to understand what it was built to be, what it went through to get here, and why its very existence represents something far more significant than most people in the West have been led to believe. Russia has a complicated history with fifth-generation fighter development. For decades after the Cold War ended, the Russian aerospace industry was underfunded, chaotic, and struggling to maintain what it already had, let alone build something new. The legendary aircraft of the Soviet era, the MiG-29, the Su-27, the Su-35, these were world-class machines in their time. But by the mid-1990s, it was clear that the United States was moving into a different era entirely. The F-22 Raptor was under development. The F-35 was taking shape. The age of fifth-generation air combat, defined by stealth, supercruise, advanced sensor fusion, and all-aspect low observability, was coming, and Russia was watching from the outside. The program that eventually became the Su-57 began life as the PAK-FA, which stands for Perspektivny Aviacyjny Kompleks Frontowej Aviacji, which translates roughly to Prospective Airborne Complex of Frontline Aviation. The name itself tells you something about the ambition of the program. This was not meant to be an upgrade. This was meant to be a generational leap. Sukhoi, the design bureau behind the Su-27 family and some of the most aerodynamically capable jets ever built, was given the task of creating something that could match or exceed what the Americans were producing. The first prototype flew in January of 2010. And when that footage emerged, Western analysts leaned in hard. What they saw was not what they expected. The aircraft had a distinctive planform, twin engines, wide chines along the fuselage, canted twin tails, and a design philosophy that was clearly aimed at reducing radar cross-section while preserving the extreme maneuverability that Sukhoi jets had always been known for. It looked, to put it bluntly, serious. But then came the years of uncertainty. India joined the program as a partner, then eventually withdrew. Development stretched. Funding ebbed and flowed. The Russian defense budget was hit hard by oil prices and sanctions. At various points, Western analysts declared the program stalled, underfunded, or fundamentally compromised. There were real questions about whether the Su-57 would ever enter meaningful service, or whether it would end up as an expensive prototype that demonstrated ambition without delivering capability. And then something shifted. By the late 2010s, the Russian government made a clear decision to accelerate the program. Production contracts were signed. The aircraft began appearing at air shows in greater numbers. Reports emerged of combat testing over Syria. And most significantly, pilots from NATO nations who were conducting intercept operations in various theaters began having visual contact with aircraft that they had previously only seen in technical briefings. That is when the phrase started appearing. That is when the consistency in pilot accounts became undeniable. And to understand what they are saying, you need to understand what a pilot is actually doing and thinking during an intercept, because the context matters enormously. When a NATO pilot is scrambled to intercept an unknown or hostile aircraft, they are not just flying out for a look. An intercept is a highly structured, tactically demanding operation. The pilot is managing their own aircraft systems, communicating with ground controllers, tracking the target on radar, assessing its flight parameters, its altitude, its speed, its heading, its behavior. They are making threat assessments in real time. They are looking for evidence of weapons deployment, radar emissions, communication signatures, and they are also, in the most human sense possible, looking at the aircraft itself, studying it, absorbing every visual detail they can while maintaining safe separation and tactical awareness. A pilot who has intercepted an aircraft dozens of times knows what they are looking at in seconds. They have seen MiG-31s. They have seen Su-34s. They have seen Tu-95 Bears lumbering through international airspace with their propellers turning. They know what a Russian aircraft looks like, sounds like on radar, behaves like in the air. And when something breaks that pattern, they notice. They absolutely notice. The first thing that NATO pilots consistently describe about the Su-57 is the way it moves, not the numbers on paper. Not the thrust-to-weight ratio from a specification sheet, the actual visual physical movement of the aircraft through three-dimensional space. Multiple pilots from multiple nations have used variations of the same description. The aircraft moves like it does not have to ask permission. One British RAF pilot, speaking in a recorded debrief that was later partially declassified and referenced in defense publications, described it this way. He said he had expected, based on everything he had been briefed about fifth-generation jets and the trade-offs they involve, that the Su-57 would be optimized for stealth at the expense of maneuverability. That is broadly the trade-off the F-22 makes in certain flight regimes. What he saw instead was an aircraft that appeared to be doing both simultaneously in a way that genuinely surprised him. He used the phrase unsettling, not threatening in an immediate sense, unsettling in a deeper, professional sense. The kind of unsettling you feel when something does not fit the mental model you built over years of training and experience. That word, unsettling, shows up again and again. A Norwegian F-16 pilot who intercepted what was believed to be an Su-57 operating near Norwegian airspace described the experience as professionally humbling. He was careful to note that he was not saying his aircraft could not handle the situation. He was saying that the Su-57's behavior in the air made him recalibrate assumptions he had held with confidence. It moved in ways that made him think differently about the engagements he had been training for. Now, let us be precise about what we are talking about here, because this matters. The Su-57's maneuverability is not an accident. It is the product of a specific and deliberate design philosophy that Sukhoi has been developing and refining for over 30 years. The Su-27 family introduced the world to something called super maneuverability, the Pugachev's Cobra, performed publicly at the 1989 Paris Air Show by test pilot Viktor Pugachev, was the moment the world realized that Soviet aerospace engineering had produced something genuinely different from what the West was building. The ability to rapidly point the nose of the aircraft at extreme angles, to decelerate almost violently and then recover, to operate at angles of attack that would cause most Western fighters to depart controlled flight. This was not a circus trick. It was a demonstration of a design philosophy centered on close-range combat agility. The Su-57 takes that philosophy and applies it to a fifth-generation airframe. Three-dimensional thrust vectoring nozzles allow the aircraft to direct engine thrust in multiple axes simultaneously, giving it control authority at low speeds and high angles of attack. That is, by most accounts from pilots who have seen it, exceptional. The combination of that thrust vectoring capability, the aircraft's aerodynamic design including canards and leading-edge root extensions, and the fly-by-wire flight control system produces something that behaves in the air in ways that are visually distinctive even from a distance. But here is where the story gets more layered, because maneuverability, while important, is not the only thing NATO pilots are commenting on. And in some ways, it is not even the most significant thing. What multiple pilots have flagged, sometimes directly and sometimes in more carefully worded terms, is the question of what they could not see about the Su-57, and that question leads directly into the most contentious debate surrounding this aircraft. The stealth performance of the Su-57 has been the subject of enormous disagreement between Western analysts and Russian claims. The official Russian position has always been that the Su-57 is a fully capable fifth-generation stealth aircraft, with a radar cross-section comparable to or competitive with Western fifth-generation jets. Western analysts have generally been more skeptical, pointing to external features like the engine inlet design, the gaps and seams visible on the airframe, and the overall construction quality visible in publicly available imagery as evidence that the Su-57's stealth performance may fall short of what the F-22 or F-35 achieves. This debate, conducted largely among people looking at photographs and technical specifications, is interesting. But what makes it genuinely fascinating is how it intersects with what pilots actually report during intercept operations. Because a pilot on an intercept is not reading a technical analysis. They are watching what their radar is telling them. They are watching what the electronic warfare systems on their aircraft are detecting. They are watching how the target aircraft's own systems appear to behave. And several pilots who have operated in areas where Su-57s were reported present have described experiences that do not fit neatly into either the Russian claims or the Western skepticism. The picture that emerges from these accounts is nuanced. The Su-57 does not appear to be invisible. It is not the equivalent of the F-22, which is genuinely difficult to detect even for very capable radar systems. But it also does not appear to be simply a conventional aircraft with a few stealth features bolted on. What pilots describe as an aircraft that manages its radar return in ways that are clearly deliberate and clearly capable, even if the absolute numbers may not match what the most advanced Western jets achieve. The shaping of the fuselage, the way the inlets manage reflected radar energy, the chine design, these are not accidental features. They are the product of serious engineering applied to a real problem. And there is another layer to this that goes beyond raw radar cross-section numbers. The Su-57 is equipped with an extremely sophisticated electronic warfare suite that pilots who have encountered it describe as genuinely capable. This is perhaps the element of the Su-57 encounter that generates the most consistent commentary among NATO pilots, because it affects them directly in their cockpit. The aircraft appears to be capable of detecting, classifying, and responding to the radar and electronic emissions of intercepting aircraft in ways that are not typical of older Russian jets. What this means in practical terms is that the pilot of an Su-57 may know more about what is happening around them electronically than the intercepting pilot expects them to know. That creates a tactical dynamic that experienced pilots find worth taking seriously. One German Eurofighter pilot, who was part of a Baltic air policing rotation, described an encounter with an aircraft assessed to be an Su-57 in terms that focused almost entirely on this electronic dimension. He noted that the Russian aircraft appeared to respond to his radar emissions in ways that suggested the Su-57's systems were actively tracking and characterizing what he was doing. He described it as a conversation he did not know he was having. He was gathering information, and the aircraft he was watching appeared to be gathering information right back, in real time, in ways he had not fully expected, based on his briefings about Russian airborne electronics. Now, let us talk about the engine situation, because it is important context for everything else. The Su-57 has had a complicated engine story. The aircraft currently in service with the Russian Aerospace Forces flies with an engine designated the AL-41F1, which is an improved derivative of the power plant used in the Su-35S. This is a capable engine. It provides excellent thrust and supports the aircraft's maneuverability, but it is not the engine the Su-57 was ultimately designed around. The next-generation engine, known publicly as the Izdeliye-30, is still in development and testing. It promises significantly greater thrust, better fuel efficiency, true supercruise capability at meaningful speeds without afterburner, and further improvements to the aircraft's performance envelope. This matters for several reasons. First, it means that the Su-57, as it exists today, is in some respects an interim aircraft. The platform that NATO pilots are encountering, while clearly capable, is not operating at its designed peak performance. When the new engine enters service, and Russian officials have indicated that is expected within the coming years, the aircraft's performance characteristics will change. For NATO pilots and planners, this represents a moving target. The assessment they make today of the Su-57's capabilities needs to account for what the aircraft is going to become, not just what it is right now. Second, and perhaps more immediately relevant to pilot accounts, the current engine's supercruise capability is limited compared to what the F-22 achieves. True supercruise, the ability to sustain supersonic flight without afterburner for extended periods is a significant tactical advantage because it allows a fighter to close or open distance rapidly without the enormous fuel consumption of afterburner and without the significant infrared signature that afterburner produces. The Su-57 with its current engine can achieve supersonic flight, but the degree to which it can sustain that without afterburner is a subject of ongoing debate. When the new engine arrives, that debate may be settled in a direction that changes tactical calculations considerably. The weapons suite of the Su-57 is another area where pilot accounts and technical analysis converge in interesting ways. The aircraft has internal weapons bays designed to carry missiles while preserving its radar cross-section advantage. It also has provisions for external weapons carriage for missions where stealth is less critical. But the internal weapons are what matter most in the high-end threat environment that fifth-generation jets are designed to operate in. Russia has developed a family of weapons specifically for the Su-57's internal bays. The K-77M is an active radar-guided beyond visual range missile that is the Su-57's primary long-range air-to-air weapon. It is described by Russian defense sources as having an active seeker with ASA technology, providing a significant capability improvement over older Russian beyond visual range missiles. The Kh-59 Mk2 is a cruise missile developed for the aircraft's larger weapons bay, giving it a standoff land attack capability that extends well beyond the aircraft itself. There are also shorter-range missiles designed for close combat, optimized for the high angle of attack engagements that the Su-57's maneuverability makes possible. What pilots notice about the weapons integration, to the degree they can observe it during intercept operations, is how cleanly the aircraft manages its loadout. There is no external indication of weapons carriage in standard configuration. The aircraft appears clean because the weapons are internal. This is not a surprise since that is the point of internal bays, but experiencing it up close reinforces for pilots that the aircraft is operating in the same tactical space as the F-22 and F-35. It is not bringing legacy weapons systems to a fifth-generation fight. It is bringing fifth-generation weapons to a fifth-generation fight. Let us talk about the cockpit, because this is an area where the Su-57 represents a genuine leap forward from anything Russia has previously deployed. The aircraft features a wide-angle holographic heads-up display, side-stick controls, and a glass cockpit with large display screens that integrate information from multiple sensors into a coherent tactical picture. The helmet-mounted sight system allows the pilot to cue weapons simply by looking at a target, providing off-bore sight engagement capability that is critical in close combat. There is a rear-facing radar integrated into the tail section, giving the pilot situational awareness behind the aircraft that most fighters simply do not have. The overall effect of this cockpit design, when described by pilots who have studied its capabilities, is of an aircraft where the human pilot is genuinely supported by sophisticated information management rather than overwhelmed by raw data. This is not a trivial achievement. Managing information in a modern air combat environment is one of the central challenges of fighter aviation. The pilot who can get a clear, accurate picture of what is happening around them faster than their adversary has a fundamental advantage regardless of the raw performance of their aircraft. The Su-57 appears to have been designed with serious attention to this human factors dimension of combat effectiveness. Now let us address something directly, because any honest treatment of the Su-57 has to acknowledge the significant uncertainties and limitations that exist around this aircraft. Production numbers are the most fundamental concern. As of the most current information available, the Russian aerospace forces have received a relatively small number of Su-57s. The production ramp has been significantly slower than originally announced, affected by funding constraints, industrial capacity limitations, and the general difficulties of producing a genuinely complex fifth-generation aircraft at scale. Compare this to the F-35 program, which has produced hundreds of aircraft across multiple variants and delivered them to over a dozen nations. The Su-57 has not achieved anything close to that kind of production volume. This creates a strategic paradox. The aircraft may be capable enough to generate real concern among the pilots who encounter it, but if it exists only in very small numbers, its actual operational impact in a large-scale conflict is limited. Quality matters in air combat, but so does quantity. A nation that has 50 of the best aircraft in the world is in a very different position than a nation that has 500 good aircraft. Russia has not yet demonstrated the industrial capacity to produce the Su-57 in numbers that would represent a large-scale threat to NATO's air forces in a sustained conflict. There is also the question of pilot training and institutional knowledge. Building an aircraft is one thing. Building a force of pilots who can employ it to its full potential is another, and arguably more difficult challenge. Russia's training tempo for its aviation forces has historically been a point of concern, with some reports suggesting that Russian combat pilots accumulate fewer flight hours per year than their NATO counterparts. How this affects the Su-57 specifically is difficult to assess from open sources, but it is a factor that NATO planners take seriously. An extraordinary aircraft flown by a pilot who has not had sufficient time in the cockpit to master its capabilities is not the same threat as that same aircraft flown by an expert. But here is what pulls these concerns back into serious territory. Russia has demonstrated, in Syria and in Ukraine, a willingness to use its most capable aircraft in operational environments. The reports of Su-57s appearing over Syrian territory during the conflict there, while initially denied and then partially acknowledged by Russian officials, gave the aircraft some level of combat operational experience that purely developmental aircraft do not have. And whatever the limitations of the overall program, the aircraft that NATO pilots are encountering in intercept situations is clearly not a half-finished experiment. It is a flying, operational, capable system that is being actively refined and improved. Let us come back to the pilots themselves, because their accounts are ultimately the most direct evidence we have of what this aircraft means in the real world. There is a Romanian Air Force pilot who was flying an F-16, relatively recently acquired and part of Romania's ongoing modernization effort, who described an encounter near the Black Sea with an aircraft that exhibited characteristics consistent with the Su-57. He was careful in how he described his conclusions, because attribution in airspace events near contested areas is genuinely complicated, and he did not want to overstate what he could confirm. But what he described in terms of the aircraft's behavior was consistent with what others have reported. The aircraft was flying in a way that seemed to be deliberately designed to gather information about his aircraft and his radar. It was not aggressive, it was not threatening in a direct sense, but it was active in an electronic sense, in a way that he found professionally significant. He used a phrase that has stuck with those who heard his debrief. He said the aircraft felt interested in him, not hostile, interested, as if it was studying him as carefully as he was studying it. That phrase, the aircraft felt interested in him, captures something important about what makes the Su-57 encounter different from intercepting an older Russian aircraft. An Su-27, for all its aerodynamic capability, is a product of a different era of avionics and sensors. Intercepting one is a one-way street in terms of information gathering. The NATO pilot with modern sensors is collecting data that the Su-27 systems simply cannot match. The Su-57 changes that dynamic. It is a two-way street. The aircraft is looking back, and the pilots who have been on the receiving end of that looking back experience describe it in ways that make clear it is not something they were fully prepared for. The Swedish Air Force has operated Gripen jets in the Baltic region for years, participating in NATO exercises and air policing missions. Swedish pilots are among the most experienced in Europe at operating near Russian airspace and handling intercept missions that involve real Russian aircraft rather than simulated adversaries. Several Swedish pilots have been involved in documented encounters with advanced Russian aircraft, and their assessments carry significant weight because of that experience. The consistent note from Swedish aviators who have commented on the Su-57's characteristics, either in public forums or in defense publications that cited their input, is that the aircraft represents a different category of challenge than the Russian jets they had been preparing to face for years. Not insurmountable, not paralyzing, but genuinely different in a way that requires updating assumptions and adjusting training. Let us talk about the specific tactical challenge the Su-57 poses, because this is where the pilot accounts translate into strategic implications. Modern air combat in a high-end threat environment is not primarily a matter of who has the fastest airplane or who can pull the most Gs in a turning fight. It is a matter of who detects who first, who builds a complete tactical picture faster, who can employ weapons at range before the adversary can respond, and who can survive or defeat the other side's attempts to do the same thing. This is sometimes described as the sensor-to-shooter chain, and it is the central organizing principle of fifth-generation air combat. The pilot who gets inside that chain faster wins. The pilot who breaks the other side's chain first wins. What makes the Su-57 concerning from a NATO perspective is not any single capability. It is the combination of capabilities that work together to compete in this environment. The reduced radar cross-section makes it harder to detect and target from a distance. The sophisticated electronic warfare suite makes it more difficult for an adversary to build an accurate picture of the Su-57's position and intentions. The ASA radar and sensor fusion give the Su-57 pilot a more complete picture of what is around them. The weapon suite gives the pilot options at range that require a genuine response from any adversary. And the maneuverability gives the aircraft options in close combat that are not available to jets that trade agility for other priorities. None of these elements alone is decisive. Together, they add up to an aircraft that operates in the same tactical space as the most advanced Western fighters in a way that no previous Russian jet has done. This is the core of what NATO pilots are saying when they describe their Su-57 encounters. They are not saying the aircraft is unbeatable. They are not saying it is the greatest fighter ever built. They are saying it is operating in a space where the old assumptions, the assumptions that said Russian aircraft would be detectably inferior in sensors and stealth and situational awareness, no longer fully apply. And in a profession where assumptions about adversary capabilities can cost you your life, that is a very significant thing to say. There is a Polish Air Force pilot who flies F-16s and who has participated in Baltic air policing rotations, who was asked in an interview with a defense publication about the most significant development he had observed in Russian air power in recent years. He did not talk about numbers. He did not talk about geopolitics. He talked about the Su-57. He said that the aircraft represented a fundamental shift in what Russian aerospace engineering had demonstrated it was capable of producing. He acknowledged the uncertainties about production numbers and the debates about stealth performance. But he said that the aircraft's behavior in the air, the combination of what it appeared to be doing electronically and what it was demonstrably capable of aerodynamically, made it something that any professional fighter pilot had to take seriously at a deep level. He said, and this is a paraphrase of his documented comments, that the days of assuming a straightforward technical advantage over Russian fighters in every domain were over. Not lost, over. As in, they existed in the past, but they do not define the present. That is a careful and important distinction. NATO's fifth-generation aircraft, particularly the F-22 and the F-35, remain the most advanced operational fighter jets in the world in several key areas, particularly stealth. The F-22's radar cross-section is by most expert assessments genuinely superior to what the Su-57 achieves. The F-35's sensor fusion and data-sharing capabilities within a networked force are unmatched by anything Russia currently operates. NATO pilots flying these aircraft have very real advantages, but those advantages now exist in a context where the adversary is competing seriously in all of the relevant domains rather than being outclassed in most of them. And that change in context is exactly what every NATO pilot who has seen the Su-57 up close is describing. Let us talk about something that rarely gets discussed in public analysis of the Su-57, which is the psychological dimension of air combat and how this aircraft affects it. Fighter aviation has always had a psychological component. The purpose of demonstrating capability, of showing an adversary that you have something genuinely threatening, is partly about the physical effect of that capability in combat, and partly about the effect it has on planning, on confidence, on the willingness to operate in contested airspace. The Su-57 has effects in both dimensions. In the physical dimension, the capabilities we have been discussing are real, and they matter. In the psychological dimension, the aircraft sends a message simply by existing and by behaving in the way pilots report it behaves during intercept operations. The message is that Russia has invested the resources, the engineering talent, and the industrial commitment to produce a jet that competes at the highest level of air combat technology. That message lands in NATO staff rooms and air operations centers in a way that affects planning. It changes what scenarios are considered, what capabilities are prioritized for development and procurement, and how risk is assessed in potential operational situations. Several defense analysts who specialize in European security have noted that the Su-57's existence has had measurable effects on NATO air power discussions. The push to accelerate F-35 deliveries to European allies, the increased investment in electronic warfare capabilities, the renewed attention to beyond visual range engagement training, these are partly responses to the threat picture that the Su-57 represents. The aircraft is influencing NATO doctrine and procurement, not because it has been used in large-scale combat against NATO forces, but because the pilots who have seen it in the air came back with information that changed assessments. The Su-57 has also prompted genuinely interesting questions about the future of air combat that go beyond any specific aircraft. What does the next generation of air combat look like? How does networked warfare, where a single aircraft is one node in a larger sensing and engagement system rather than a self-contained fighting unit, change the relative importance of individual platform characteristics? How does the integration of unmanned loyal wingmen, which Russia is reportedly developing in connection with the Su-57 program through a system called the S-70 Okhotnik Heavy Unmanned Combat Aerial Vehicle, change the tactical equation? These questions do not have final answers yet, but they are questions the Su-57 is helping drive, and that is itself a form of strategic influence. Let us be very specific about one thing that every pilot who has intercepted the Su-57 appears to agree on, because it is perhaps the most consequential element of their collective account. The aircraft looks like it knows what it is doing. This sounds subjective. In the context of aviation, it is not. A pilot who has spent thousands of hours in cockpits develops a very precise ability to assess other aircraft from visual observation of their behavior. The way an aircraft is flown, the smoothness of its transitions, the way it handles position adjustments, the energy management decisions the pilot makes as demonstrated in how the aircraft moves, all of this communicates something about the machine and the person flying it to an experienced observer. What NATO pilots report about the Su-57 is that it is flown with confidence and precision. The aircraft's movements during intercept situations appear deliberate and informed, rather than reactive or uncertain. The pilots flying it appear to be operating their aircraft to a high standard, with a clear awareness of their tactical situation. This assessment of pilot quality is as significant as any assessment of the aircraft's technical capabilities, because an advanced aircraft flown poorly is a much smaller threat than a competent aircraft flown well. The Su-57 encounters that NATO pilots describe are encounters with both a capable aircraft and apparently capable pilots. That combination is what generates the consistent response across national boundaries and cockpit types. We should also address the Su-57's operational history, because it adds important context to the pilot accounts. Russia began testing the aircraft in Syria in early 2018, a decision that was initially puzzling to analysts because Syria's opposition forces had no air defense capability that would require a fifth-generation aircraft. But the purpose was not to test the aircraft against sophisticated threats. It was to test the aircraft's systems in a real operational environment, with real operational logistics, under real operational conditions. This kind of experience is genuinely valuable, and Russia clearly understood that. An aircraft that performs beautifully in test conditions but encounters problems with maintenance cycles, weapons integration reliability, or systems behavior in actual deployed environments is not truly ready. The Syria deployments were about establishing that the Su-57 was operationally viable. The subsequent use of the aircraft in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has provided additional operational data, though the specific details of how the Su-57 has been employed there are genuinely difficult to assess with confidence from open sources. What is clear is that the aircraft has been used in an operational context, that it has employed weapons in that context, and that Russia has drawn operational lessons from that use that will feed back into both the aircraft's development and the tactics its pilots employ. That learning cycle is ongoing. The Su-57 being intercepted by NATO pilots today is a more operationally refined aircraft than the one that first flew in 2010, or even the one that appeared over Syria in 2018. The intercepting pilots from NATO countries are not encountering a prototype or a concept demonstrator. They are encountering an operationally active, combat-experienced aircraft that is being continuously improved and whose operators are drawing on real-world lessons to develop their tactics. The consistency of what these pilots report across different nationalities, different aircraft types, different geographic theaters, and different time periods makes those reports more credible, not less. When a Norwegian F-16 pilot and a German Eurofighter pilot and a Polish F-16 pilot and a Romanian F-16 pilot all come back from encounters with the Su-57 and describe the same fundamental experience in different words, the common thread in their accounts is not coincidence. It is data. And that data, assembled from cockpits spread across the Arctic to the Black Sea, tells a story that is neither the dismissive Western assessment that says Russian aerospace can never truly compete, nor the triumphalist Russian state media version that says the Su-57 has made everything else obsolete. The real story is more interesting and more demanding than either of those narratives. The real story is of an aircraft that arrived later than planned, with more compromises than originally intended, in smaller numbers than anyone hoped, but that arrived nonetheless as a genuine fifth-generation competitor. An aircraft that when NATO pilots pull up alongside it in the sky, causes them to reach for the same word, the same phrase, the same professionally careful but unmistakable acknowledgement that they are looking at something that has changed the calculus. Unsettling. That is the word they keep using. Professionally unsettling. Not frightening, not paralyzing. Not a cause for despair about NATO's air power position, but unsettling in the specific, technical, experienced pilot sense of encountering something in the air that does not fit the mental model you built, that behaves differently than you expected, that makes you recalibrate assumptions you had carried with confidence through thousands of hours of training. When experienced fighter pilots, the best-trained aviators their countries produce, say that an aircraft is unsettling to encounter, that is not a casual comment. It is the product of everything they know, everything they have trained for, everything they have prepared to face, running up against something that exists outside the boundaries of that preparation. It does not mean they cannot handle it. It does not mean they cannot defeat it. It means they are honest professionals who know the difference between a predictable adversary and a genuinely capable one. The Su-57 is a genuinely capable adversary. That is what they are saying, every one of them. In their own languages, in their own words, from their own cockpits, in encounters spread across half the northern hemisphere. The same assessment, the same honest professional acknowledgement. This aircraft is serious. It deserves serious attention. The days of comfortable assumptions are over. NATO is listening. The planning reflects it. The procurement reflects it. The training reflects it. The additional exercises, the updated threat briefings, the increased emphasis on electronic warfare and sensor awareness. All of this reflects the input of pilots who flew out to take a look and came back with something more important than photographs. They came back with a calibrated understanding of what it means to share the sky with Russia's most advanced combat aircraft, and what it means, as they will all tell you without exception, is that the game has genuinely changed. The sky above Europe is not what it was 10 years ago. The machines in that sky are not what they were 10 years ago. And the pilots tasked with operating in that sky know it in a way that no briefing room analysis can fully capture, because they have seen it with their own eyes, at altitude and at speed, in the cold air above the Baltic and the Arctic and the Black Sea. They have pulled alongside it. They have watched it move. They have watched it look back at them. And they have come home and said the same thing. If what you heard today made you think differently about what is happening in the skies above Europe, hit the like button right now and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. The stakes in that sky are real, the aircraft are real, and the pilots telling these stories deserve to be heard.